Grace Meng didn't walk into that hearing looking for confrontation. There was no performative outrage, no raised voice, no theatrical buildup. But the moment she locked eyes with Patel, the temperature in the room shifted. You could feel it. This wasn't going to be another forgettable oversight exchange destined to disappear into the archives. This was a collision between someone asking for clarity and someone suddenly struggling to maintain control of the narrative. What Meng raised in those opening minutes seemed technical on the surface. Budget documents, accounting rules, federal compliance. But in Washington, technical questions can be the most dangerous ones of all. She calmly laid out the facts. Since 2022, the executive branch has been legally required to maintain a publicly accessible system posting apportionment documents. These aren't optional memos or internal notes. Apportionments are formal, legally binding federal budget documents, required under the Anti-Deficiency Act. They dictate how and when agencies may legally spend taxpayer dollars. They exist precisely to prevent misuse, abuse, or secrecy in federal spending, and then she dropped the key point, beginning in March. Those documents stopped being publicly available. No explanation. No notice, just gone. Meng reminded Patel that during his confirmation hearing, he had emphasized the need to restore public trust in the FBI. Transparency, she noted, is not a slogan, it's a practice. And if the Bureau truly wanted to rebuild credibility, public accountability for how taxpayer money is spent would be a logical place to start. Then she asked the question, as the leader of the nation's primary federal law enforcement agency, would he commit to making the FBI's legally required apportionment documents publicly available? Patel said yes. Meng didn't move on. She clarified that the law already requires public posting. This wasn't a discretionary request. This wasn't optional. Was he committing to follow the law? Again, he said yes, this time with a caveat. He wasn't an appropriations expert, he said. But if that's what the law requires, that's what they would do. Then came the follow-up that tightened the vice. Did he have a timeline? And why had the documents been taken down in the first place? Patel didn't have an answer. He promised to get back to her. And with that, Meng pivoted smoothly, deliberately into territory far more explosive. She turned to Ed Martin, the president's nominee for U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, one of the most powerful prosecutorial roles in the country. Martin was already serving in the role on an interim basis. And as Meng noted, the FBI is responsible for conducting background investigations on nominees for positions exactly like this one. Then she laid out what had come to light. Martin had publicly praised Timothy Hale Cuccinelli, a known Nazi sympathizer who had been convicted for his role in the January 6th attack and later pardoned. Martin had referred to him as an extraordinary man and an extraordinary leader. When confronted, Martin claimed he hadn't known about Hale Cuccinelli's extremist views despite those views being widely documented. Meng didn't accuse. She didn't editorialize. She asked a question that cut straight to the FBI's responsibility. Is this the kind of conduct the FBI should be scrutinizing during background checks for nominees to top law enforcement positions? The room went quiet because by that point the pattern was clear. This wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't about budgets. It wasn't about one nominee. It was about whether transparency is real or rhetorical, whether background checks are thorough or selective, whether accountability applies evenly or bends around power. Meng didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She let the facts do the work. And by the time her time expired, she had forced a reality into the open that no amount of talking points could erase. In Washington, clarity is dangerous. And Grace Meng had just introduced a lot of it into the room. Patel tried to keep his answer narrow. He thanked Meng and explained that he wasn't personally familiar with Ed Martin's specific background investigation. What he did instead was zoom out and describe the process in general terms. According to Patel, FBI background investigations are handled by career professionals within the Inspection Division and Human Resources. He emphasized that these teams operate independently and that the Standards for investigations haven't changed during his tenure. The investigators, he said, decide what information is gathered and what is passed along. Leadership does not tell them what to include or exclude. Meng didn't let the general explanation end discussion. She asked directly whether Patel knew if Martin's past statements and associations were part of the investigative record. Patel admitted he did not know. He said he wasn't familiar with Martin's personal background and didn't have the file in front of him. So Meng sharpened the question. She didn't ask about Martin anymore. She asked about principle. In general, she said, should public praise of a known Nazi sympathizer, along with documented anti-Semitic remarks and extremist associations, be considered relevant information for an FBI background investigation? Patel hesitated. He said that because Martin's nomination was still pending, it wouldn't be appropriate for him to comment on the specifics. Again, he stressed that he didn't have access to the background investigation itself. Meng pressed again, narrowing the scope even further. This wasn't about rewriting reports or interfering with agents. It was about judgment. In Patel's view, should comments and associations of that nature be included in a background check? Patel deflected once more. He said those decisions are made by field agents conducting the investigation. He added that he doesn't interfere with their methods and hasn't changed how those investigations are conducted since taking the role. Meng made one final request. Would Patel at least agree to look into the matter and ensure that controversial, troubling, and anti-Semitic statements or affiliations are appropriately considered in background investigations? This time Patel said yes. He agreed to follow up, but Meng wasn't finished. She moved to another issue. One that struck directly at morale inside the FBI. Earlier in the year, the Department of Justice had demanded a list of all current and former FBI employees who had worked on January 6th investigations. According to internal communications, that list was to be reviewed to determine whether further personnel actions were necessary. Meng asked Patel a straightforward question. Did he anticipate firing any additional FBI employees simply because they had worked on January 6th related cases? Patel responded that the memo in question had been issued before he arrived at the FBI. He said the issue hadn't been addressed since his arrival because it was now part of ongoing federal litigation. Meng repeated the question. Would any FBI employees be fired solely for working on January 6th investigations? This time, Patel answered clearly. He said the only way an employee would be fired under his leadership is if they violated ethical guidelines or broke the law. Meng thanked him and yielded back her time, but the impact of the exchange lingered. The tension didn't come from shouting or confrontation. It came from precision, from questions that were documented, carefully framed, and difficult to escape. It began with a term most viewers had probably never heard before: apportionments. A word that sounds technical, even boring. But that was the point. Meng wasn't talking about obscure paperwork. She was talking about legally binding instructions that govern how federal agencies spend taxpayer money. Rules designed to prevent misuse. Documents required to be public. Transparency written into law. And once she put that framework on the table, everything that followed from background checks to January 6th investigations fit into the same theme. Accountability isn't optional, and silence, deflection, or delegation doesn't make the responsibility disappear. But earlier this year, those documents quietly disappeared from public access. There was no announcement, no explanation. They weren't relocated to another page or archived for review. They were simply gone. And that disappearance raised a serious red flag. Meng put the question directly to Patel on the record. Would he commit to restoring the FBI's portion of those legally required financial documents and making them public again? Patel answered yes, as long as the law requires it, but that answer immediately exposed a problem. The law already requires it. That obligation has been in place for years. There was never a question about whether these records should be public. They were supposed to be public the entire time. That's when Meng pushed further and asked the obvious follow-up. Why were the documents taken down in the first place? Patel didn't have an answer. He didn't offer a justification. He didn't point to a policy change. He didn't give a timeline for when they would return. He simply said he would get that information, and that's what made the exchange so significant. It wasn't just a verbal promise anymore. It was a commitment made under oath during a congressional hearing. If those documents don't reappear, Congress now has a clear record showing when the question was asked and how it was answered. And if they do reappear, every spending decision made during the period when the records were missing becomes fair game for scrutiny. That moment alone could have dominated headlines, but Meng wasn't finished. She shifted the focus away from budgets and transparency and toward something even more sensitive: judgment and integrity. And with that shift, the tone of the hearing changed instantly. Her next question centered on Ed Martin, the nominee for U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C. She didn't hedge her words or bury the issue in vague language. She named him directly. She referenced his public statements. And she highlighted reports showing that Martin had openly praised an individual widely described as having extremist sympathies according to those statements. Martin had called that individual an extraordinary man and an extraordinary leader. Those comments were already controversial on their own. But Meng's concern went deeper. She asked whether those statements and associations were reviewed as part of the FBI's background investigation. This wasn't an abstract concern. The U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., oversees one of the most powerful prosecutors' offices in the country. That office handles national security cases, civil rights enforcement, public corruption, and some of the most sensitive investigations in the federal system. Any failure to fully vet a nominee for that role would be a serious breakdown. Meng made it clear she wasn't making an accusation. She was raising a question about process. Public statements, controversial affiliations, and documented praise of extremist figures should matter in a background investigation. Ignoring them would be deeply troubling. Patel's response was cautious and tightly controlled. He said he wasn't familiar with Martin's personal background. He explained that FBI investigators determine what information is gathered and included. He emphasized that he does not alter or rewrite their reports. Everything he said may have been technically accurate. But what stood out just as much was what he didn't say. He didn't confirm whether the statements were included in the background check. He didn't confirm whether investigators flagged them as a concern. He didn't confirm whether anyone inside the FBI raised questions about Martin's public praise of someone linked to extremist ideology. And that silence mattered. Meng's question wasn't about assigning guilt. It was about standards, about whether transparency, judgment, and accountability still guide how power is vetted before it's handed over. And by framing it that way, she forced the hearing to confront an uncomfortable possibility that critical information may have been overlooked, minimized, or quietly set aside. Observers online later pointed out that Meng's use of the word should was deliberate. She wasn't offering a political judgment. She was defining a professional standard. Background checks are not meant to reward loyalty or punish ideology. They exist to assess risk, judgment, character, and associations that could compromise someone's ability to enforce the law fairly and independently. When Patel responded, "That's up to the field agents," it initially sounded procedural, even reasonable. But as he repeated the phrase, its meaning shifted. It stopped sounding like a description of process and started sounding like an effort to distance himself from responsibility. It wasn't an affirmation that the system works. It was a refusal to vouch for how rigorously it does, and Meng wasn't asking him to speculate. She wasn't asking him to pass judgment on a nominee. She was asking for a commitment. Would he look into it? Would he ensure that controversial public statements and troubling associations are treated as relevant information in background investigations? After a brief pause, Patel said yes. Another promise, now on the record. Another commitment that could be revisited later if the facts don't match the words. But the most consequential moment of the exchange was still ahead. After finances and vetting, Meng turned to an issue that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community: Earlier this year, the Department of Justice had requested a list of all current and former FBI employees who had worked on January 6th investigations. Not a list of cases. Not a list of task forces. A list of people. According to emails referenced during the hearing, the stated purpose was to determine whether additional personnel actions might be necessary. That phrase alone raised alarms. Personnel actions based on which investigations someone worked on. Strike at the core of law enforcement independence. If agents believe their careers can be threatened for handling politically sensitive cases, the consequences are immediate and corrosive. Investigations slow down. Hard cases get avoided. Leads that point toward power quietly disappear. Justice becomes selective, not because the facts aren't there, but because the risk becomes too high. Meng asked Patel directly whether he anticipated firing any FBI employees simply because they had worked on January 6th related investigations. This wasn't a hypothetical. It wasn't political theater. It was about protecting career agents who followed evidence, conducted interviews, and did their jobs without knowing whether the facts would be popular or inconvenient, Patel answered cautiously. He noted that the memo was issued before his arrival. He said the issue was now tied up in federal litigation. He explained that the Bureau hadn't acted on the request since he became director, but Meng didn't let the question fade into procedural fog. She asked again, more directly. Would he fire anyone solely for having worked on January 6th cases? This time, Patel gave a firmer answer. He said the only way someone would be fired under his leadership was for violating ethical guidelines or breaking the law. On its face, it was a strong statement. Reassuring even, but context matters. If the memo still exists, even dormant, what happens when litigation ends? What happens if the Justice Department renews the request? What happens if pressure is applied from outside the Bureau? Patel's words sounded definitive, but the circumstances made them feel provisional. Clear in the moment, uncertain in the future. A promise made under oath, hanging in the air, waiting to be tested by events yet to come. What became clear during this exchange wasn't that Patel was deliberately dodging responsibility. It was that Meng systematically boxed in future decisions before they could even be made. She didn't accuse. She documented. She forced commitments onto the public record. Transparency in spending. Integrity in background checks. Protection for career investigators. Each promise was spoken out loud, recorded, and preserved for Congress to return to later. Patel can't claim misunderstanding or misremember what was said. The commitments exist. They are now part of the official record. But the reason this exchange resonated so strongly went far beyond those promises themselves. It exposed a larger truth about how accountability actually works. Transparency isn't a slogan. It's a mechanism. When financial records disappear, oversight weakens. When background investigations are inconsistent or incomplete, public trust starts to erode. When investigators fear retaliation for doing their jobs, justice doesn't fail all at once. It fades quietly, long before the public realizes what's happening. That's why this hearing mattered. None of Meng's questions were about scoring political points. They were about the structural integrity of the justice system itself. Federal agencies must clearly show how taxpayer money is spent. Nominees for powerful positions must undergo serious, impartial vetting. Law enforcement officers must be protected from political punishment when they follow evidence wherever it leads. These are not technical details. They are foundational requirements for a system that claims to operate under the rule of law, even reasonable. Explanations, technical errors, administrative delays, privacy concerns only work if they are communicated clearly and honestly. When agencies stay silent or offer vague answers, suspicion fills the gap. Confidence collapses. Communities pull back. Witnesses stop cooperating. Extremist narratives thrive in the absence of transparency, making it harder for law enforcement to do its job effectively. What Meng did in that hearing wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was something far more consequential. She reopened doors that had quietly been closing. She demanded clarity where ambiguity had become routine. She placed accountability back where it belongs, on those who wield authority. She reminded both Congress and the public that oversight isn't optional. It's the cost of legitimacy in a democratic system. For viewers, the reaction wasn't about party affiliation or personal loyalty. It was about watching someone ask direct questions without fear, without hesitation, and without bending to political pressure. And watching Patel respond carefully, deliberately, made the stakes unmistakable. Transparency is not optional. Vetting is not a formality. Protecting investigators is not negotiable for anyone who cares about a justice system that actually functions. Moments like this are the line between accountability and the slow, dangerous erosion of public trust. If this breakdown helped clarify what really happened in that hearing, make sure to like the video, leave a comment about which moment stood out to you most, and subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives that uncover what these hearings truly mean for everyday people.